Okay, I said a few things. Well, I'll probably say them again. I might not. Who knows? We're looking at Chronicles, but Chronicles is this book that it repeats. It tells the story, and the short of it is what it is it goes from, it tells the story really from beginning to end. And like Kings and Samuel, they were originally one book and then were divided up into two when it was translated into the Septuagint sometime in the first, the last few centuries BC. As it was being translated, they divided them up for scroll length. And you'll see, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but that Chronicles, the Chronicles, as it was originally understood or originally titled, actually has a connection to Ezra and Nehemiah. And there's some debate over whether it's an official one or not, but we'll dig around in that as well. But just the context of where it fits. And again, maybe it's worthwhile saying, so last week we left Kings, and at the end of that, they were going into exile. Do you remember? Does that ring a bell? Everyone, they had all these good kings, bad kings. The northern kings were all bad. The southern kings had Judah and Benjamin, and they were doing okay, but they had some good ones. And they ended on Hezekiah, a good king. But then the Babylonian Empire comes in and basically conquers it, and they go into Babylonian exile. And it wasn't until the end of this exile period, and we're going to talk about this guy today, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, that defeated the Babylonians in 539 BC. And so the earliest that this book, Chronicles, would have been written, compiled, assembled, would have been that date. It's post-exile. So when the Babylonians were defeated, and because, as we'll talk about later, Cyrus had a soft spot for other nations' religions, so he not only returned the Israelites to Jerusalem, to the Promised Land, but also ordered the reconstruction of the temple. And this is the second building of the temple. So what we have in this entire book, and I'm going to go and I'll go through some of the nitty gritty of the book itself, but just as we approach it, you have to think that this book that tells the story from Adam all the way up to this point where they're returning to Jerusalem is being told in a succinct form for the purposes of transmission to the people who are returning from exile into Jerusalem, into the original Promised Land, with the ability to worship their God Yahweh, and the ability to occupy the temple, and that the king of the Persians, the Cyrus guy, is actually rebuilding the temple for them. So a lot of this book has a very temple-oriented focus, because the temple is that spot where God dwelled with Israel. And so reestablishing the temple is a major piece that came with Solomon that was lost in the destruction of the temple, and this is the reestablishment of that temple. And so that emphasis is really like, hey, this is an important part of who you are. And that's not to say there's not the assumption that they didn't have a connection to the whole story, but the idea was really almost a reshaping of the story. And we're going to talk about that in a second too. There's some editorial choices or some nuances and the reason they can kind of date that is because some of that is reflected and it's dated. It's it dates it to Sirius. So, but all of that is connected to that idea of when they were returning. So the question is not, what was our history? The question is, who are we? This book is really about the direct idea. Of the books that we've read so far in the original Hebrew, this has one of the most sophisticated forms of grammar and structure and literary form. It is compiled and written by someone educated, someone who's probably of the priestly order. There's suspicion that it could be Ezra, although there's some scholars say that it's not. And it really doesn't make a difference who it is, but knowing that it came around that time of Ezra, when Ezra and Nehemiah were written. But it has that sense of just of as you return, or as the temple's being established, what is the sense of who Israel is? Who are we is the question that sort of guides this whole book. Is it worth, before I get into the book, is it worth doing a broad overview? I guess we're going to kind of do it going through the book. Just keep in mind that this comes, again, this picks up that chronology of where it was written, in terms of post-exile. Of course, it misses that exile period to some extent, but what it's happening in it is it's kind of like just a summary. It's an executive summary of everything that happened from Adam all the way up to the exile. So if you're like ever needed to get the whole story really quickly, you just read Chronicles. So, okay. And again, if you have questions, interrupt. Let's talk about Chronicles. Originally just called the Chronicles, in terms of a name, and then eventually in the Hebrew tradition, it was called the Events of the Days. And again, keeping in mind when it was written, this is, many, many years after it's happened. And so the original name was Events of the Days. And then when it was translated into the Septuagint, sometime in the last centuries of before Christ, it was called The Things Omitted, or The Things Left Out. Because for a lot of times people thought it was like sort of, there were a few new things in it. There were also things left out of it, but it was kind of a summary of it. And so it was kind of considered like almost a glorified appendix to Samuel, in particular Samuel and Kings, because there's a lot of information about the Kings and about the genealogy and that sort of thing. And then in the late 4th century, when Jerome, one of the early church fathers, after Christianity became legal, translated the Bible into Latin, that's when it became known as the books of Chronicles. And that then was later on moved to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So the name has sort of just evolved. It really shouldn't, like, honestly, like, I don't know why in the last, however many years of the church, no one said, hey, you know what, we should really combine some of these things. Like, it doesn't pose any problems to us other than the fact that it's just been traditionally done this way. So I like the idea of them being read as one, but I guess you can always in any introduction introduce them, say this is one, so you have that mindset. Authorship, I said, was likely, or could have been Ezra, or likely a contemporary of Ezra. Ezra came from the Levite line and was a priest of the priestly order, and was educated, and was an organizer and a compiler. And so much of what we find in Chronicles are actually verbatim pieces from Genesis, Exodus, and Kings and Samuel and other books. They're pulling sections of them out, and there are some tweaks and some editorial choices. But really, the where you see, and I think it's very interesting, where you see within this book, one, they know that they feel confident, scholars feel confident it was written by one person, but you can see that one person's commentary in a number of places, like the speeches that kings and prophets make. What was the other thing? Speeches that the kings and prophet makes in the people, and how they're presented and how they're approached, and the characters. We were talking last week how character formation is not really the goal of reading some of the scriptures. Well, this was like the first Christian educator, this Ezra, whoever wrote this, because he was trying to write it with the idea of forming someone's values or virtues through it. In other words, he was making catechetical choices, or pedagogical choices, if you will, around the idea of this was something to teach and train new Israelites post-exile. So through the speeches of kings and prophets, you have this insertion of the perspective of a post-exile chronicler, being Ezra, maybe. The people, you have that sense of character or virtue being presented, like they're saying, this is the good king, he did this. This is what, and this is the bad king, and the bad, good stuff followed the good king, bad stuff followed the bad king. Very formulaic. And the last thing are the events tend to point towards values and morality. of what happened in the interaction. So, and again, but really in that, not in the sense of our puritanical understanding of values and morality or ethics, but in the sense of obedience and disobedience and the outcomes that come from that. So the virtues they're promoting are obedience and adherence to God's commandments, and they're trying to, and the writer is trying to reshape a post-exile Israel as they step back into their new land. Again, audience post written. It's thought to have been written really from the perspective of Israel as a unified state altogether, and that's important because you know that they separated, and then there was a north, and as we looked in last week, there was the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and there's a lot of fragmentation. And the northern kingdom was invaded by the Assyrians. They spread north, and there was a diaspora there. And then when the southern kingdom was invaded, they tended to all shift east, or many of them shifted east, I guess into Egypt as well, west, but primarily into a Babylonian occupation and exile from the land. But when it's being written, there's a sense that Israel is one nation, that there is no north. It talks about the north, as you'll see, it talks less about the northern kings of 101, but it talks about Israel in the sense of Israel as a whole, which is, again, part of that identity shaping narrative. The idea is not to present the history in such a way that says, well, there was the northern half and then there was the southern half, and they didn't really get along, and they had good kings and bad kings, and they fought, and these were the tribes in the northern king. It's saying this is unified Israel. Because they're reestablishing who they were as a people. In the ordering of our books, we stick them at the end of our Deuteronomic history, which is rightfully so, kind of a compendium at the end, and it kind of, in terms of when it was written, it would have followed narratively from that, or chronologically from that, and the recapment of that, and really some of the new information, it fits where it does, and it will bleed into then Ezra and Nehemiah. And actually, I'll show you this later. Interestingly enough, though, the last two verses of Second Chronicles actually are the first two verses of Ezra. So there's a sense, which is another reason why they think that it was a similar author or a contemporary written and a friend, so you even as far. But in the Jewish canon, it actually is at the end of their writings, or their it falls at the end of like kind of like more like an appendix, and so it was there. My guess is because it was written later, but it falls much. In other words, we stick it sort of in the middle, and then we carry on with the story. They're sticking it at the end, so that suggests some sort of catechetical purpose, perhaps, that they placed it there. They saw it as a recap or a shorter version, but obviously with recognition that even the author of that's going to have a slightly different perspective from when the other books were originally written. I said it was temple focused, covenant focused. It relies and reiterates all the covenants, in particular the ones with Moses and with David. There's a strong Davidic vein running through the book as a whole. As we finger through it, you'll see. What else? I think that's it for I guess the two themes that will surface, and I think this probably comes with the closer readings. We may not be able to pick up on them as much today, but the coming of the Messiah is a theme, like the sense of who the Messiah is, and you're going to see that more so. You're not going to see it directly. You're going to see it and again in those lessons, those moral lessons or those character lessons that the author is trying to promote. There's a sense of this is the good king. So what we'll see a bit, you could even say, and it's a bit of what we would call hagiography, in the sense of sometimes hagiography is the veneration of saints, or the tales of saints of doing things that were miraculous, and over time the stories grow and get bigger and bigger, and that's just how it works. Well, if there was a version of David's life that was trying to sort of make David look better, like, in other words, if you only read the story through Chronicles, you wouldn't get as many failures from some of the characters. They weren't presenting a well-balanced view that David messed up and God still loved him. They're presenting that David was a really incredible king and is the model then for the future Messiah. Does that make sense? There's a forward looking in the sense of the author of Chronicles wanted to take this image of who David was and cast a vision for who the Messiah would be. Now, if you were on church on Sunday, this makes even more sense why Nathaniel, when I talked about the fact that Nathaniel really thought that Jesus was about a physical person, like the son of David was the king, was not that he was the divine, but that he actually was the son of God in the sense of an earthly sense. And so part of the reason Nathaniel would have had that vision is because of Chronicles and the nature in which they portrayed the coming king of Israel.
I have a question.
Go
Jay.
for it. And then yep.
If most of the people that went into exile went from the southern kingdom, wouldn't that be what happened? They came from the southern kingdom?
Well, they would have, the northern kingdom was exiled, I think, chronologically first. But
I mean the ones that went to Babylon.
What about them?
Wouldn't they have been from the southern kingdom?
They would have, yes.
And then how are they, in this book, how is it trying to get the tribes back together? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it does so more so in the rhetoric of it doesn't talk about the massive divisions. It presumes almost that David was the king. And in fact, I read somewhere, and I don't remember what verse it related to, but it ignored the first 7 years in its recountment of David's reign, of where David was only king over Judah, the southern kingdom. And it just included that sense of all of Israel. Where did I write? Or maybe I wrote something down there. And part of it so that comes into the theme piece. There were 3 themes that one commentator listed that I thought were interesting. And the one we're referring to is concern with a national identity. Again, these Israel coming post-exile, they're coming back into Jerusalem. They're trying to figure out who they were in exile for 70 years, trying to figure out who they are, wanting to bring that identity back to them. So when he says all of Israel, he includes the sense of north in the meaning. And as you remember in Kings, like it was just like when you recounted more, the Kings recounts more the northern kingdom and the evil nature of it than it does the southern, if you recall. And then there was I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 chapters at the end that were on the southern kingdom where David was, and Solomon and the temple in Jerusalem. But up in the northern kingdom, there was a sense of they were just, I think it was the count was 20 for 20 up north were all bad. And I think if I recall, it was like 13 to 7 or 12 to 8 or something like that I probably have it somewhere. For the south that had good kings and bad kings, 8 to 12. So there in the sense there, but in the sense you also get a much stronger picture of the southern kings. And this does the same thing that a little bit you get in Kings, of chronicling the kings and what they did and what are the good ones and the bad ones. And so there's a sense of highlighting them, but the good and the bad are there and are cultivated portraits of good and bad kings for the purposes of formation of people. So in other words, when you look at this book, you got to look at it through the lens of that this was written to form a new generation.
And they're supposed to take in the northern kingdom people because they were divided. They were a split nation, and so this is encouraging them to bring in the other brothers from the northern kingdom? Or
I think it's encouraging anyone who was a tribe of Israel to see themselves as Israel, and that they all draw their lineage or their line from King David. At one time they were united under King David and Saul and David, and then Solomon came along, it was okay, and then it started to get bad after Solomon, and then that's when you have Rehoboam and in the north and Jeroboam in the south, and in the battle. That was all last week. I know that's, and I know I hit it with, it's a lot of history last week, but that separation happened after Solomon, and what you have, and then that led, and then again, when Kings ends at the beginning of the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem. So you have that return, and you have the rebuilding, and in that rebuilding, the chronicler is trying to reshape Israel's identity. No doubt they still have the other passages and other things, but, and not only that, but actually I say that one of the commentators said that they thought that that Ezra, or the author, was writing not really even ultimately to the people. It was more like it was written almost to his peers. So it was meant to sort of even shape the leaders, if you will. It wasn't even like, it wasn't written for the people. Most people wouldn't have been completely literate enough. They would have been able to read this anyways. So it was really written for more of an educated peer group, probably for, and if he was a Levite, if he was a priest, it would have been written for a priestly order as well. But definitely with the mind to shape that identity. Yeah, Glenda.
I have a couple questions. One is about I noticed as I was just looking kind of an overview of this, the pages and pages of just names of tribes and the descendants. That's one question. What's the whole purpose of recording?
You mean the first 9 chapters?
Yeah, and various places you just get all these names. That means nothing to us today, really. Yeah. What was the purpose of including all that? That's one question. But the other one is, I am really bothered by that story because I don't remember reading it before, about at the end of David's, or closer to the end of his reign, I think, there was that incident where he wanted to count the people and he got punished for that. And then God gave him a choice. And I think it's at the end of Samuel, and then it comes up again in Chronicles. Gives him a choice of 3 possible punishments. And he says, I can't choose, you choose. And then he gets that huge plague or whatever of 70,000 people die. What was wrong with counting the people? Why was it such a dreadful thing that had to be punished so widely like that?
I don't know, would be my immediate answer. If you were to ask me to take a stab or a guess, I would say, I don't know, maybe it demonstrated distrust. It's kind of like, why would striking a rock for Moses with a little bit of an angry spirit prevent him from entering the promised land? And actually, we'll come back to the first one in a second. Interestingly enough, also about this book, there was a lot of inner, like, sort of in commentaries, in thoughts about it. There was a sort of smaller subset. Sometimes you have these little smaller nuggets that don't really make it to the surface because they're not super interesting, but that there is a unity identified, or a that exists in sort of the movement from David to Solomon that mirrors almost sort of the passing on that Moses and Joshua had a part in, although the lineage is different, in the sense of King David's job was to be the first king that really drew Israel together under one monarchy, and draw up the plans and really develop the worship and establish the worship firmly for Israel, from which the plans for the temple were taken. But his job, or his task, was not to build the temple. And so in the same way that Moses got cut out of going to the promised land, David got cut out of seeing the temple built and seeing, I probably would have saw part of it built, but seeing it in its completion and its fullness and its glory. And so there's that sense of that passing on, but the author views it, and really when you look at the book as a whole, you have chapters 1 through 9 are kind of like genealogy, and we'll talk about that, which answers your first question in a second. And then the second part of the book is David's reign, and then the third part is Solomon's reign. And those are really looked at as kind of either a middle third, or even though they're different parts because they end with death and beginning of reigns, there's a sense of unification between those two, that one is like part A of, and one is part B of one thing. It wasn't as if it was 2 different parts or 2 different covenants. It was fulfilling the same covenant, if you will. Whereas the Mosaic covenant, some of the other covenants Solomon didn't get technically his own covenant. He goes from the Davidic covenant to the new covenant. So The great covenants of Israel end with the Davidic covenant. And then the last section is just the Jerusalem's return to Babylon, from Babylon. So, okay, to answer the first question, really is kind of one of the other themes that run, and you're asking, and when we look at that, why do you have so many lists? And maybe the best way, well, let me give you the other theme. The two of the themes that I thought were interesting were the narrative continuity, and we'll get into the genealogies, why that's there. There's a continuity, a desire to connect people. But the third one is really interesting, and I think it would require even a closer read to really get it. But there's a strong I can't say the word, retributive. Someone say it for me. Retributive. Retributive sense. Thank you. Retributive sense of justice. There's too many letters in there. And what you get in that is a sense of like, if you do bad things, this bad thing's going to happen. If you repent, restoration will happen. And it's a strong cause and effect. But again, that's because they're forming identity. And this, the identity stuff is really not something that even the comment. So I just so you know that that's my own layer of insertion over this whole thing. As I read it for identity, and because in my world of practical theology, identity formation is what we talk. That's what we deal with. The idea that how this book is used catechetically to form Israel all of a sudden this is the fascinating part. That as I dug into it, I thought, oh, this is actually really interesting because this is like early Christian education. How do we summarize the story of everything that happened? But every summary we do is always has a personal perspective, unless you're just presenting, historic facts. But the idea that in Chronicles, cause and effect are being used to teach morality is a very interesting thing, or to teach a value or identity. They're trying to say, again, you do this, you disobey, you do these sort of things, you're going to get this sort of bad thing happen like this king. If you do obey, you do good things, blessings will follow. Okay, so those are the three sort of overarching themes. Yeah.
In the Old Testament so far, I see God as a very scary God.
Yeah, man.
It just, it really, it's disturbing.
And I'm glad you said that, Jim, because it's disturbing, because we're raised in a therapeutic culture.
Yes.
That says that we want God. So here's one of my rabbit trails. It'll only take about a minute. In the early 2000s, they did a gigantic study, the largest of its kind in the history of Western or any civilization for that matter. It's called the National Study of Youth and Religion, and it examined really how people understand the millennial generation in particular, how they understood faith. And one of the things that they discovered in that, distilling it down to a catchphrase, would be that the main religion or the main spiritual outlook of millennials, and again, those are probably roughly born between 1983 and 2005, if you will, or 80 to 2000, are that they are moral therapeutic deists. Meaning they see religion or faith as about morality, meaning it tells them what's right and wrong, or it tries to tell them what's right and wrong, that it's therapeutic in the sense of it's most supposed to make them feel good about themselves and bring sense into the world, and it's deistic, that God is there, real, legit, absolutely a presence, but way off there and not really concerned with my everyday life. So basically you have a relativistic morality that comes from their own sense, but they give a absolute authority that comes with the church. Now, the reason I tell you that is because that therapeutic, that middle one, moral therapeutic deism, the morality comes from the silent generation. The therapeutic individualism comes from the boomer generation, and the deism comes from the Xers. So they're an amalgam of the three previous religious outlooks of the previous generations that preceded the millennials. But most of your generation, the boomer generation, you brought the therapy to church. Whether you may not want to admit that, but and it's not your fault. much of psychological research around the individual came about really from sort of the early 19, well, I mean, they started in the early 20th century, but sort of had a heyday in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in doing so, that sense of shift of scholarship away from anthropology and sociology, which focus on people groups, it focused on the individual and personhood and what it means to be a person. And then this gave rise to a sense of all sorts of civil rights, women's rights, that sense of like, I'm a person myself, American Disability Acts, all those sort of things. All these sense of who people are individually came from the boomer generation, fighting for these things because they were in a day and age where this was cutting edge research about the individual person as a whole. All that's to say is that the reason this is an affront is because that therapeutic understanding of the gospel also includes within it that God is a perfect, loving God. And that is not a message prior to the 1930s or 40s, probably, that you would find in most American churches. They would have a far more puritanical or Great Awakening view of sinners in the hands of an angry God, which is more akin or more connected to this view that you're talking about, Jim. So if this is somewhat offensive, or you feel like this isn't the God I was told that I was raised with, it's because you were raised in an era that said that God was perfect love, perfect goodness, and we were the sinners, and we had to kind of figure ourselves out and have a self-actualization. But the goal then of religion was to make us feel better about the world and better about ourselves and who we are. So what you're feeling is normal and reasonable, but keep in mind historically that prior to the 1930s and 40s, most people viewed God as being a bit more of a sinners in the hands of angry God, that there was this sort of that Christ was the substitutionary atonement. Christ bore the sins because we were sinners, as opposed to this sort of, and in the last even 30 to 40 years, you have this, what's called a moral exemplar, that Christ came on earth to show us what love was. It's a lot more fluffy, and there's truth to it, but it's not the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry, that was a big rabbit trail.
No, I needed that. Thank you.
So thank you, boomers, for the therapeutic parts of the church.
Do we all feel good?
And for what it's worth, my generation gave the millennials the deism, and really sociologically, I would argue that the reason we were deist is because we're latchkey kids. Our parents were the first ones with dual working family units. And so we were the first ones to let ourselves in the house while our parents were away. And as I like to joke, we microwaved Velveeta and watched Scooby-Doo. And so we took care of ourselves till our parents came home from their jobs. But that sense of deism, that God is not present intimately in my life for the Xers, and that whole sort of dark Winona Ryder reality bites, Kurt Cobain, Nirvana vibe that comes from the Xers is because, and the reason they feel that God is distant is because in many ways, many of them feel like their parents were distant and they didn't have those connections with their parents that they had from previous generations. So, which is probably why we as a generation are helicopter parents, because we're making up for those deficits.
Very interesting.
Circle.
So anyway, that's all what I do in my normal world before I took a pastorate. So that's the sort of stuff, and honestly, we'll get into that stuff. I want to talk about at some point, probably over the summer. I'll talk about intergenerational stuff and some of the theories that go into how this all, and then really even in more in depth how we're formed as people. But okay, all that's to say is I don't know how we got off track, but let's get back on track. And let's jump into it. We're going to kind of go through I'm going to flip through, and most of them are retelling of the stories. So I'm not going to retell the whole story, but I'm going to make some commentary on where things were at. The first 9 chapters of this thing are just genealogies. That's a long genealogy, 9 chapters. Those people probably don't even read them. They probably like, okay, boring. But as I dug around in it, and I think it's interesting. One, Matthew begins with a genealogy. Matthew is one of our longer gospels. Matthew has a sort of the narrative or the chronicling of Jesus's highlights. And so really there's a sense of the chronicler. It was almost a gospel writer of the story of Israel's redemption. Naming of the people and all the people named all the way from Adam. And you're like, why is this necessary? Maybe they could, maybe you should just go back to Abraham or something. But there was a real and again, through the lens that this was given to a new generation who were occupying a new Jerusalem with a new temple, refashioning themselves as a people. This was to show them where they came from. You came from Adam. You are part of this race that journey along the way and experience the flood. You are from this line of Noah. You were chosen out of this race of people in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Saul, King David, Solomon, all the way up this line, all the way up to that brings you to the place where you're now returning to Israel. You can trace who you are back to the very first human beings that God created. And in doing so, it makes a serious kingship claim or lordship claim over who Yahweh is. It completely embraces whoever's reading it in the cosmology of Judaism, that God created this way, that God established a people this way. And this for them was sort of it would have been a main piece of their history and who they were. So naming these, and again, that chronology and putting it into this chronicle or this group of this book, naming who those important people were shows those connections all the way back to Adam. And it's saying not only is Israel your story, the story of Israel's redemption and God's faithfulness, it's not just your story as Jews, it's the world's story. It's everybody's story. It's all there is. It's claiming absolute sort of monopoly over the sense of how they would view history and the cosmology of the world. So that is why, and it goes, and there are themes that run through that sort of lead toward that messianic prediction of David being that first. David's often called the first Christ. Or sometimes Christ is called the second Adam or the second David because he fulfilled. They were expecting a king like David, but that sense of David was meant again to be portrayed as this ideal prototype or archetype for who Christ would be, and that comes and connecting that through that line is critical. You also see a priestly voice, and that probably is a priestly line drawn through there. And again, if Ezra or the writer was a priest or of the Levite line, there's a sense of, hey, and they were a chosen tribe, so the sense of wanting to emphasize the Levite or the priestly side of it. But that's in general, to answer your question, Glenda, that's why those first 9 books or chapters that we probably gloss over, and we divide them into 9 chapters, they're just there, but that was important for the Israelites who formed this new identity to see where they came from and to see this lineage and to have those names being put before them again and again. Okay, questions about 1 through 9? Okay, what time is it? 10 through 29, really to the end of the book, is really about David. And if you want to go to it, we can kind of just finger through some of the stories. And you can, and in your Bible, actually, if you look at it, you should be able to see that each of the chapters, I'm going to stand up here. Each of the chapters in those 1 through 9 kind of break apart, descendants of David and Solomon. It kind of goes through descendants of Judah, and as again, this goes to the various tribes because this is an accounting for anyone, northern or southern tribe, as they're trying to reunite around Jerusalem, who they are and where they came from. But we pick it up in 9, you can say inhabitants of Jerusalem after the exile, and then it goes into who's living there, and it highlights the priestly families and the Levitical families who came from Saul. And then it begins in chapter 10 with the death of Saul and his 2 sons. And that is almost an exact retelling of what you find in 1 Samuel 31. And it connects the story of sort of Saul and David, but it presents the transition between Saul and David as being much more smoothly than it happened. It doesn't mention all of the almost death and the running and the exile that David had from, like it kind of glosses over this and doesn't mention that animosity. Doesn't mention, and as it goes into, it's not going to mention Bathsheba or the indiscretions, again, because it's a book that's meant to teach character. So they're trying and portray that archetype of who Christ is. So they're not going to portray the negative things about David. And so but in some way, when you know that, reading it, it kind of is like, are you filtering? But if you don't understand it as being a teaching tool, it's one of those things that's kind of like George Washington. Well, George Washington was a slave owner, just like everyone else was at the time. We don't talk about that, not because we're trying to hide the fact that he's a slave owner, because it was normal back then. And so what we do is we lift up George Washington's virtues because he's a part of our history and he's a figure in our own, in our background of our nation. And so we want to portray him in a good light. Same thing is true in many ways for this. That doesn't mean, and again, this goes back to that original first challenge that we had when we started meeting with the Bible study. What does this say about, like, are these compiled books? Or is every word here written because God wanted them written? Does that mean that the stories that are left out, that was okay to leave them out? Well, I mean, yes and no. It depends how you want to look at it. At the end of the day, if you look at it as a teaching tool, they're trying to teach something and do something with it, as opposed to just be a historical reaccounting of. There is some new material that's introduced in this section on David in chapters. And if you want, let's just go through, it talks about Jerusalem being captured, David's mighty men and their exploits, and it goes through those and highlights them in a little bit more filtered way. David's followers in the wilderness, David's army at Hebron, the ark brought, so they're kind of walking you through David's early days. David, in chapter 14, you have David's established in Jerusalem and the defeat of the Philistines, and chapter 15, the ark being brought there. 16, the ark being placed in the tent and prayers around that, and his psalm of thanksgiving. You have regular worship maintained or designed, and you have a lot of instructions around that. And 17, you have God's covenant with David. These are just all major things that are going on or that have gone on. And again, many of these are almost verbatim from pieces of them are almost verbatim from the original documents, which it's just sort of streaming together. It's another prayers, and that was the one thing I will say. I didn't go through all the prayers, but they did say that that's where you can see some of that post-exilic understanding or sort of perspective is in those speeches and prayers. 18, David's kingdom is established and extended, and that was into the northern side, into where the Philistines were in the northern area. David's administration, defeat of the Ammonites, goes through that. Exploits of the Philistines, kind of just the census and the plague. And it kind of just goes through and it lists, and it really, until you get to 22, most of it is just taken from other parts of scripture. And then you get into 22, and from 22 to 29, you have some new material which talk about the preparation of the temple. And these were, again, instructions. And these were things that were, if you do go back and read these, keep in mind, these were written with the reestablishment of temple worship after 70 plus years of exile. So that would have been, again, with the lifespan being much less back then, you would have had, you may have had a few people still sticking around, but there's a sense of reestablishing who Israel was in their temple worship. So you have this larger section on the preparation for temple worship. And then I have here 28, 11 through 19 makes David somewhat akin to a second Moses, in the sense of connecting who the covenants and who David was in relationship to who Moses was. And there's, anytime you have a sort of leadership, any biblical leader, any major, always comes from a humble beginning and all those sort of things, but a little bit more of an explicit connection. And then what else do we have here? Oh, okay. So in 28, 11 through 19, I don't know, this is sort of a random thing, that it was to show that David was an ideal king. And that's where you get that section right there, 28, 11 through 19, is sort of that projection of David as the coming Messiah. And so that sense of who he was, and so the temple worship was then preparing the Israelites for the coming of the Messiah. Stories about a good David, a positive David, is they wanted to shape then again the idea that this past king was not only a fantastic king, but the new king, which would be the Messiah or Christ, would be this sort of similar or second David. And that sense of, again, what we talked about on Sunday when Nathaniel said, Son of God, King of Israel, there was a sense of he was the second David, or he was the Messiah that was promised in this sort of narrative itself, because he would have been taught or trained by this as well. Okay, let's stop there, because that kind of brings us right to the end of chapter of First Chronicles, and then we'll pick up Second Chronicles. But is there any immediate questions on that?
I have a question, Jason.
Yeah.
How did whoever was writing this and whoever was embracing this get from what has to be one of the worst stories in the Bible of David, Bathsheba, and David trying to kill Bathsheba's husband to Messiah? How did they wrap their mind around just putting that story aside? I mean, what in the world? I mean, do you see the problem somebody might have with that? I
do.
I don't know. Maybe
I do.
Maybe I'm too sensitive, right? It's just another day at that time in history.
I mean, you could say that. I mean, in a very sensitive spot, you could say that about our Trump. You could say that about, and not just to pick on Trump, you could say that about any president or any, you go all the way back to Kennedy. Kennedy is esteemed as this wonderful leader and rallied that, there's a lot of dirt on Kennedy too. In other words, like, we all have sorted past, and as time goes on, the question becomes, do we demonize the figures of our past? We probably make some of them heroes and some of them villains. There's always that sense of interpretation, hermeneutic, or in the history of how we view the past. So, yeah, Jim.
Jumping ahead to when Jesus was saying he was the Messiah, wasn't he totally different from David, though?
Oh, absolutely.
He wasn't. For them to believe in Jesus, they had to really basically not believe what David is supposed to be as the Messiah.
Well, no, and I guess Messiah meaning the anointed one.
Right.
Sometimes we attach Messiah, there are a number of mentions of Messiahs in Scripture, and David would have, had been portrayed in that way. Actually, and even at the end of Chronicles 2, Cyrus is portrayed that way, and actually says, where did I write that down? That in Isaiah 45:1, it uses the word Messiah for Cyrus, and actually it's the only time they use the word Messiah, the anointed one, for a Gentile in Scripture. Mm-hmm. And so our cultural connotations of Jesus being the Messiah, you describe that to him as a unique term, whereas in Israel's sense of language, it would have been a extremely rare word, but it would not have been a word exclusive to the coming Messiah. So, honestly,
there's a huge difference between an anointed one and Emmanuel, God with us.
Yes. And Emmanuel's retroactive too, or retrospective better, because again, that sense of God with us and that incarnation, no one really truly understood what that sense of incarnation fully meant. The Jews of the time didn't, again, from Sunday, Nathaniel didn't see it as a deity that had become human.
Well, the Christians didn't believe God was with us until 400 years after, at the Council of Trent.
Well, that's when they confirmed that. I think there were earlier beliefs. I think there's a lot of confusion. A couple weeks ago when we were talking about adoptionism, there are lots of views. There are lots of views and lots of reasons to view Christ in terms of the heresies that surfaced. Mm-hmm. Was he a man that got adopted? Was he supernaturally? Was he a ghost? The sense of that he was not really in the form of humanity. He just looked in the form of humanity. All of those things have points in Scripture that lead us to think those things. But I think in general, Emmanuel being God with us was understood, sometime post Christ, that sense of incarnation of who God was.
Well, Jesus was not bashful about claiming to be the Son of God and to be the revelation of God.
No,
he claimed that for himself. So that's not a theological assumption.
No, which is why I don't remember who it was that said that Jesus either had to be a lunatic, a liar, or
C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Is C.S. Lewis who said that?
I think so.
So yeah, but I mean, he would have had to have been a lunatic. That no one would claim to be the Messiah if they weren't the Messiah or the Son of God. I mean, obviously he put his money where his mouth was, so to speak. Okay, Second Kings, or the second half of, or not Kings, sorry, of Chronicles. We get into its one. You have about 36. I guess how many chapters? 36. Is that what it is? 30. You have 36 chapters, and really the vast majority of it, if you want to go, we can flip through it. It kind of chronicles the various kings, and again, but in different from what Kings did, that focused on the failures of the north and just kind of highlighted them in the south. Because this is again written from Jerusalem, going back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem would look to be at the center. There's a fuller treatment of actually the southern kings, but really only focusing on the good ones, again, for that character development stuff, and highlighting the bad ones. But not to say that there was completely it wasn't like the northern kings were cut out. It was a sense of, if you were in exile and it was 70 years, and again, oral tradition, all those sort of things, Israelites weren't living to themselves well anyways. This was reestablishing in many ways just a new narrative for some of these people who would only have had it delivered orally from people who really were in exile because they were disobedient to God in the first place. So the formative nature of Chronicles shouldn't be overlooked in that regard. There are a few new stories of some unfaithful kings, but in general, you start it and you have the first 1 through 9. Again, sort of paralleling some of the characteristics, if you will, from a literary perspective of the first 9 books of the chronology of the genealogy, I mean. But you have kind of the building of the temple, and this is the fulfillment of that section on David saying he prepared the worship, and this is how you're going to worship. Now you're getting the story of the great temple that was built by King Solomon, and our ark is brought into the temple, and Solomon's prayer of dedication to the temple, and Solomon dedicates the temple like again and again, and there's a sense of who Solomon was, and again portrayed well. Not that he was not his bad sons, not that he was up on the rooftop having relations with all of the harem, like all the stuff that was bad about Solomon gets washed away as well and gets scrubbed out, and you just have this sense of who he was in a positive sense, again saying he was a great king. And then it moves from 10 to 28. You have sort of a chronology of the southern kings, and I did think there was one list. Where's that? This book fell, and I saw a list that I wanted to show you in a book here. This is Second Chronicles, and that breaks down, and it's not really even worth even going into too deeply, but that is the number. All of that is Second Chronicles, of the sections from 10 to 28 of all the different kings of the southern kingdom. And so it highlights some, and it goes all the way up. And then the last from 29 to 36, you have a recount of Hezekiah, which you recall from last week was the king who discovered, a scroll that had the original, that demonstrated trust against God against the Assyrians. So there was that sense of he was one of those good kings in that final era. And really, you only have in chapters 14 through 16, you have a good king in Asa. You have another good king from 17 to 20 with Jehoshaphat. You have a bad king that ends it out in 28, and then it turns to the good king in Hezekiah, which ultimately led to the conquering of the Babylonians in the Babylonian exile. And there is that sense where when they drew back together, that reuniting of the that monarchy, that sense of unification, that they were all, because they were all in diaspora, they're all in exile, that they were gathered together. In the last chapter, in 36, again, you have, it goes through the last 4 kings, and then it leads to the exile, and then it ends with this reference, and that's where I'd like to go to now, of Syria, or Cyrus, and you find, where is it, his account of Cyrus proclaims liberty for the exiles here at the very last. That shows in the last chapter the fall of Jerusalem, the reign of these people, Jehoiakim, the reign of Zedekiah, and then in 28 chapter 15, or 28 verse 15, you have the fall of Jerusalem, and so Jerusalem is then exiled, and then you have Cyrus's proclamation for liberty for the exiles, and so you have this sense that this was the to be continued of this book, which is why many scholars think that it actually is connected to Ezra, because the last, again, I said earlier, the last 2 verses are the same from Chronicles 2 or 2nd Chronicles. Those last 2 verses. Thus is the King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah, again, the southern kingdom. Whoever among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. And some commentators feel like this is actually a run-on sentence. Let him go up pauses in the Hebrew in a way that was abrupt. And the thought is that was actually the sort of to be continued ... Because then when you turn in your Bible to the next page, and then we'll look at Ezra, and maybe, I don't know if we'll do Ezra and Nehemiah together. I have to dig around them and see what we find. But if you look around in Ezra, at the beginning of it, it says, in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, or the word of the Lord of the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished. Oh, no, in chapter 2, or in verse 2, thus says the King of Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heavens, has given to me the kingdom of the earth, and has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of you among you are his people, maybe their God with them, are now permitted to go up. And that's where it ended in Chronicles. And then it carries on in Ezra to Jerusalem and Judah to rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. So that connection point, it shouldn't be overlooked, because this, and Cyrus, again, I said, he's looked at as this sort of savior of Israel, because he had a soft spot for even though he was conquering things, still had a sense of they have a different way of worshiping than I do. I'm going to allow them to worship. I'm going to send them back. And Cyrus, whether God spoke to Cyrus in some way, we don't know those details, but Cyrus felt that the Israelites needed to return to Jerusalem and to reestablish and rebuild the temple. So even as a Persian king, ordered the second rebuilding of the temple.
Cyrus did that in many cultures, not just the Israel.
No, yes.
He did it in several to do that.
When I said he has a sensitivity or softness, it was not just there; it was across the board. Because you had the Assyrians come in, then you have the Babylonians come in, and then you have Cyrus coming in. Yeah. And so you have this Persian Empire. Really, kind of, if you look, and I don't have a map right here, but if you take a map of and you look, it kind of goes from the Mediterranean all the way over what is to consider modern, I guess, right before Pakistan. It was huge, and it went up to some of the seas. And so, in actually one of the maps that I saw, it looked like if you take all the bodies of water, so you have the Red Sea down here, and you have the Gulf over here, and then you have the 2 seas up here. They broached all of the water barriers, and it was extended out. And then I also read that actually modern Iranians hold Cyrus as being like the epitome of human existence, and it's like a huge cult following around him in terms of a historic character. That's it. That's all I got.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Was Jerusalem sort of unusual to be up on a hill where the other kingdoms' capitals weren't? Because is that why it says, let him go up? And then it said something about going up.
I don't know.
On the first chapter of Ezra, it says Cyrus said, let them go up?
To
Is that
Jerusalem.
because Jerusalem's up on a hill?
No, I mean, it's kind of like people say go up to, it could have been I mean, I wouldn't think that necessarily meant the actual geographic hill. I think it was probably more like ascend to your promised land. It could have been. I don't know, to be honest with you, Donna.
It just struck me funny that he would say, let them go up.
Well, it ends that. I think what's funny is that it ends that way and then picks it up, and so it's that continuation over into this next book. So interesting book, much more interesting than I was expecting. I was kind of dreading it, to be honest with you, but I came out of it feeling pretty like, oh, that was actually, again, I'm just noodling around in it, but that sense of the catechetical use for teaching Israel and the choices that were made with the mindset of post-exilic, Jerusalem and rebuilding of the temple, the desires that the author would have had. And even in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, we're not just, no one is an island. Ezra, whoever the author of this, would have had all sorts of people in conversation with what were the important things. And if he was a priest, that would have been discussions about what is important for the people of Israel to know as they reestablish themselves in this nation.
Question.
Yep.
You have, seems to me, kind of indicated to us that we should not look at scripture as the story of role models. And yet, are you saying that the writer of Chronicles was doing that with these characters?
Yes. And I'm not saying scripture doesn't teach us about character, but I'm just saying that you have to take the context in the same way you would with this one. I mean, and in what you're seeing in this, because we've worked our way through these passages and we see the darkness in some of the stories and the failure of Israel, you see it. If you go back to read Chronicles, you'd be like, wow, this kind of makes everything seem kind of rosy. But again, they're wrestling with who Israel is. And they're really wanting to shape the narrative of who people are. And you do that by often shaping those who are educated or leaders, because trickle down theory eventually it'll make its way. But even the priests that would have been, I mean, again, they came up through the Levite line, so they would have passed that on. So the nuances both reflect the catechetical nature and probably the place they were in terms of the post-exile.
It seems to me that God always wanted throughout the Old Testament his people to always be aware that they were a chosen people, chosen for a purpose, and
yes,
from whom the Savior
and chosen from without merit.
Right, exactly. Not from themselves.
Not from their own righteousness.
We don't have it since so much today, do we?
No, and I think the challenge of that is Christianity is not an ethnic religion. When you have culture on your side. So I mentioned earlier the National Study of Youth and Religion, and they actually put on this big scale of how people are doing in terms of passing down faith to young people. And one of the anomalies was the Catholic Church actually fared the worst. But us mainline Protestants weren't too far behind them. And so then you have Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans, and then you have like American Baptists, and then you have evangelicals, and then you have non-denominational, just sort of not particularly labeled. And then you have racial, ethnic churches, then you have Pentecostal churches, then you have Mormons. So Mormons of all of the main American religions, I guess, that are being, of Christian, they see it as a branch of Christianity to some extent sociologically, but Mormons are doing the best to pass that on, and not because they share an ethnic identity, but because they share a ecclesial or a spiritual identity that says you're you're a Mormon. It's kind of like the Amish. It's like you don't get out. It's not an option. We, again, going back to that, boomer psychological sort of launch and all the scholarship, that idea, there was this generation of Xers and even millennials that our parents said, we want you to choose your own faith. And that was the first time in the history of religious, communal religious convictions where any religion said, oh, you can choose your own faith. We'll present a good example. We want you to have a good experience, but in the end, we want you to make this decision. And again, that's that personhood, that sense I need to make the decision for myself. Prior to that, it was, you're a Christian. You're raised as a Christian. That's all you are. You have no choice in being a Christian. You don't have a choice in going to church. This is who we are. All of those things were said. If you break from us, you're breaking from the community of who you're a part of. We don't live in that world anymore. So it's a challenge to try. I mean, for parents today to get their kids to go to church because they feel like, oh, I want my kids to like me. But I'd rather have my kid, know who he is in Christ than like me. Because if he does, then he'll like me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any last questions? If not, we'll call it a night.
Hey, thanks.
Thank
Oh,
you.
thanks for being here. This has been we're going to start getting into a little bit of muddy territory at some point. Once we get into those prophets, then I'm just swimming. It's the blind leading the blind. I said at some point when Shannon was homeschooling Judah, at some point, she was like, when she got up to like 9th grade, she was like, I got to actually start looking at stuff now and preparing. So it's been smooth sailing for me, just because a lot of this is in the back of my head somewhere, just refreshing it. But when we get, I don't think I ever learned the minor prophets or the major prophets well. I think I just sort of tried to skate through that part of. So it's been good. Rediscovering this has been really good for me too. So I'm glad that you all are here. I'm glad we're on this journey together. I think when it all comes to culmination, we'll feel like we've been on a trip. So,
Yeah.
All right. Blessings and safety for you all, and we'll see you soon enough.
Yes, thank you.
See you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.